This weekend has been a weekend of many things. On Saturday, we had the National Trayvon Martin Day, a day that we looked at the case of Trayvon Martin. But beyond that, President Obama on Friday talked about Trayvon Martin and the state of African Americans in terms of their response to Trayvon Martin. Today on Candy Crowley's State of the Union, Newt Gingrich, of all people, talked about the Great Divide, and it's a very serious issue that things are seen in black and white. And it reminds us of the indictum by Abraham Lincoln that the nation could not exist in two parts. In that case, he talked about the North, the South, but the divide now is not the North, the South. The divide is much more sophisticated. It's based upon race and also upon class, and there were a number of shows talking about that. And you will hear a little of a roundtable discussion in addition to Newt Gingrich, Charles Blow and company there with Candy Crowley. They also had an African conservative type. I have to get her name here. Crystal Wright was there. Cherie Eiffel were representing Sanity, along with our own Representative Bobby Rush. Bobby Rush has been around a long time. He's from Chicago. He's a congressman. At one time, he was in the Black Panther Party. In fact, the only race that President Obama ever lost was to Bobby Rush. That's a milepost. But he was talking about this Bobby Rush, the problems of African American males, unusually high or a very high incarceration rate, whereas the conservative Crystal, I have to keep looking her name up there because she's not that familiar to me. Crystal, what is her name? Crystal Wright was the old conservative song back to Benign Neglect Monahan there, the African American family. But part of the problem there is that, and correctly pointed out by Cherie Eiffel, that Trayvon's family was whole. He had loving parents, although they had divorced, but he had support systems, his mother and both his father. Of course, he had visited his father when he was murdered. But that is not as relevant today in having the two-parent families, because many young children in this country are raised by a single parent, whether it be a male or a female, whether they be African American or not African American, or from the European part of the American culture or not. It is just one of the things that's happening in 2013, that families are not what they once were, if they once were that. A tremendously high divorce rate, but that's caused by a number of things. One, societal changes, quite obviously, economic changes. Out there, the whole, as Dr. Bernanke talked about, you can get that take on Numbers Man. That's our financial program of This Week in Economics. We do it here also. But much of that cyclical economic changes and structural economic changes, and as to the family, it's caused by both high unemployments in African American communities, but also at the same time structural problems that go back 30 or 40 years. And as Congressman Rush points out, in Chicago there, over 40,000 people were displaced from so-called public housing, that was Cabrini Green, etc., with no support system. Some were given vouchers and sent out into various communities in Chicago and around Chicago, but beyond housing, no transportation, etc. there, so that has caused problems. It's caused problems in the communities in terms of violence. And that is centered in a few communities, not all over the city of Chicago. And what's happened is people displaced from those projects have been put into neighborhoods, and they have displaced the people that were once in the neighborhood. So you get bands of marauders in certain areas. But this is not something that took place by chance. This is a matter of government policy. Just as there was a government policy at one time under FHA to segregate housing. Thus, people moved out of the central city and moved into suburban areas. But the access there, prior to Lyndon Johnson's passage of the Housing Act, African Americans were not allowed to live in those communities by law. So it was an apartheid nation. And in this country, it's a little bit different. You're going back 50 or 60 years. But at the same time, it's a relatively short period of time, and that's attributable to the political system. Yes, the political system is changing some. There's some would say accommodation, but that accommodation is by virtue of demographics and by virtue of the economic system in itself. Barack Obama can address people from the White House briefing room, a place 60 years ago he would not have been allowed, unless he was part of the cleaning crew. And then that would be perhaps a very tenuous situation there. But you have to recall that, of course, Washington, D.C. was a southern city, but at the same time, it was an African-American city. Less so today than it has been. It has been the victim also of gentrification. Gentrification also plays into this roundtable discussion. They had it over at Meet the Press, had on various talk shows today. But talk is cheap. The problem is solutions, and many of the people talking there, they had David Brooks and various other conservatives, they have complicated the situation. Not only do you have this great divide that Newt Gingrich is talking about, but you also have a divide based upon political perspectives. And this is where the damage is literally done in the Congress of the U.S., because you have opposing forces there, and of course these forces, the right in particular, are some of the same forces in the Trayvon Martin case. The infamous Koch brothers have literally bought up legislatures from Michigan to Idaho to North Dakota to Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, a whole list of states, and they have elected these tailor-made legislators and have passed such things as the expanded Castle Bill, otherwise known as a stand the ground. In other words, the old thing of defend one's home is one's castle. Well, in some states that castle would have been extended literally to a boat, to a car, to a camping in a tent, or any other place the person was. They could shoot and ask questions later, quite literally, back to Dodge City. And even in Dodge City, as Jerry Pittman's so fond of saying, they had to check the guns at the border. But this is only one symptom of what has happened here, and this is basically the reason for the other divide. The other pillar, of course, of this is the mass media. And by mass media, I mean the NBCs, ABCs, CBSs of the world, and other wannabes. Because what happens is these values that you hear these talking heads, they trot out the same old tired ones basically every time. They'll have so many there that are quote-unquote progressive, but they're just centrist. And David Brooks is supposed to be the centrist on the thing. But yet they'll have on the same panel, depending on which show you look at, a Travis Smiley type, one that is hostile to President Obama. But President Obama, in a very politically astute move on Friday, neutralized the Travis Smileys, Crystal Wrights, the thing, effectively put those Toms out of business. Because they have nothing now, as they say, to talk about anymore. They used to talk their rallying cries where the president hadn't said anything. Well, he spent 20 minutes, a deep personal assessment, at the same time a historical and legal assessment. You did not hear that. He used to be a law professor, so therefore he in a very coherent manner presented the facts. And it was only the facts from a historical case is what's happened here and why we are where we are today. Thus, until you have the type of presentation that President Obama gave, you really won't get very far. These panelists, noticed on Candy Crowley, they were talking over each other. Specifically, Crystal Wright. This is the old thing. If you talk loud, you can drown out the discussion. And that's what she was paid to do. Unfortunately, Candy Crowley did not do as she did in debates, was cut some of these characters off because they were going too far. And that's what happens, how your panel is balanced. Because what Crystal Wright had to say, it was said by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and Moynihan was talking in the 60s, and that's totally irrelevant today. And the same thing the heritage people talk about. But you have to understand, that's a very, very limited audience. And it gets to a point, as the commentator used to work with us, O.T. Leo would say, you get free strikes, and that's what happened to the Burpees. They struck out. They were turned into clowns. Donald Trump found that out the hard way. But he joined the circus, and thus he was one of the clowns in the circus ring. Same thing happened to Tabitha Smiley. He just disappeared. People were throwing eggs at his relatives, and that was the end of him right there. As far as these people's ability to influence numbers of African Americans, they are not. Period. So when their influence dies, the only thing they can do is present these characters as a place mat and not a placeholder on some of the talk shows. Thus, it goes back to the legislative arm, and it's very important there. Looking at Politico here, it just said another round of nominees face scrutiny. Yes, there's no doubt about that. The infamous filibuster is back. Mel Watt is in the crosshairs there. He is a pick, I believe, to go to Fannie Mae. And so is Jones, who will be the first one to make it through there, if he does, to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Farms, and now I guess now it's explosives. And also right-wing Paul out of Kentucky is talking about the DONE program, so he'll hold up the FBI nominee to be. Another nominee there, Morton Dempsey, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was that old man McCain, has got that one. Not as important. The Joint Chiefs of Staff will function with or without him. According to John Cornyn, he's number 2 troublemaker there. We are where we were before. Well, no doubt about the 60-vote thing, but Harry Reid got the compromise there, and Harry Reid can get it again. I'll pull the nuclear option on them. Now, there is a number of other nominees still out there. I was trying to find out. They did get the former Ohio Attorney General Cadre to the Consumer Bureau. That finally was taken care of. And Jones, who I was talking about, that Cormie, that's the FBI nominee. No big deal there. They can get another FBI nominee. You can find those. You can line those up every day. Mr. Perez is now the Labor Secretary. He's a Dominican, so he's in the chair there. Very important there. But we still have this gridlock, and this gridlock is not accidental. This gridlock is a situation that is brought upon by the moneyed interests. Make no mistake about it. The same people that funded the defense of the infamous George Zimmerman are the same people that are funding these legislators through their various front groups out there. The infamous Koch brothers, formerly of Wichita, Kansas, now of Los Angeles and Palm Beach, Florida. I guess they're moving around too. So this whole thing about the EPA, that's economic. It has nothing to do with anything than economics. The same thing that happened is happening in Detroit. You hear a little bit about that. We covered that over the weekend. I'm sure we'll have more to say about the saga of Detroit. In fact, there was a clip with Spivak, who used to be at Meet the Press, talking with the mayor of Detroit back in the 60s. And this whole passing, now this stuff just didn't start with Alex and the Koch brothers and all these characters. It goes back to the 60s when the so-called federal aid started to get channeled under Tricky Dicky Nixon to the states. And Republicans are very smart on this, because they know that their core base is out in the rural areas or with the hayseeds. Therefore, if they could take over in the near burbs and sometimes the suburbs, at that time suburbs, that was due to rebellions in 68 and the 60s. But by transferring this money to the states, the state legislators could divvy it up to cities like Detroit at will. And of course in Michigan, when they got a right-wing legislature and a right-wing governor, and of course the thing in Michigan is always based upon the same thing as Detroit. Nothing but blunt racism. They have used that, and they are slick to exploit it every chance that they get, every opportunity. And they are using it. And they're also using disinformation. One of the things here, while we're on this, Trayvon Martin, there has been various things printed about what his father did or did not do as a quasi legal official. First of all, he was in Virginia, Manassas, Virginia. He was not in Orange, Florida, or any place else. He was not a federal magistrate. Heard a program over the weekend where this commentator talked about a federal magistrate. He didn't know what he was talking about. First of all, a federal magistrate, I've never heard of one yet, did not have a law degree. This Zimmerman does not have a law degree, never will get one. He's retired, I believe, in the early 2000s, 2001, 2002. For about 4 or 5 years, he was a magistrate. Now, in the state of Virginia, that is not a judicial officer. It's sort of akin to a JP, one that is limited to doing marriages and various lower level custodial type things. That is about it. And that's what he did. As far as him having any great influence in the state of Florida anywhere else, he does not. The people that influenced the Trayvon Martin murder trial there are the same people behind the gridlock in the Congress. They are the same people behind these various state legislatures and what's happened to Detroit. And people obfuscating that, like Crystal Wright and these various other characters, are to be placed on O.T. Leo's free strikes rule. You hear it the first time you look at it, second time with skepticism, and the third time you throw them under the bus and back it up 2 or 3 times over them. They're done. And that is what's more happening to them in the thing of social media. The answers come out very, very quickly. It's not a long process period. One other item here about Nate Silver. He's a statistician. He's over now at ESPN. So he's now back with his roots. I guess he'll not be at the New York Times. Prior to 68, he was a baseball statistician, so he's back with that. He gained recognition for the development of the player empirical comparison optimization test algorithm, a PICOTA. He's expected to offer detailed statistical player analysis, and will continue, contribute to Oberman. I guess Oberman's coming back on ESPN2. Now, in the political year, he will offer statistical analysis for ABC News. So that's Disney. So in other words, he's switched horses now, and he has moved on. It's definitely a blow to the New York Times, no doubt about that. So his 538 blog will be there. Well, I guess Mitch Coyne or whomever will be taking it. But it is a blow to the Times, but they offered him more money at ABC NSP, so in ESPN. So now he's with them. He's with Disney and ABC. So now he's joined the Monopoly Network, so it's a totally different situation. And I would be willing to bet his statistical analysis will be a little bit different. As you join these monopolies, you are tailored by them. Now, there are other people out there that are limited by their quote-unquote their viewer group or listener group or whatever it is. And that's just what it happens to be. So we work around those issues. So it's on to the talk shows. And we have a little from Meet the Press and from Candy Crowley. And we started off here with the baseball scores. This is Boston Red for the Monday Morning Quarterback on the 22nd day of July 2013. Talked to Ellie Bill Graham tonight briefly, and he said peace out. Have a good next week.
You said, Charles, which is, sort of started on this pace, which is that things are multi-determined. There's history, there's economics, there's sort of things that are endemic to race relations that will take generations to kind of wean out. But looking at some of these figures, and we just put up, these are from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 13% of black men who are 20 years and over are unemployed. That's almost twice as much as white men who are unemployed. Black median income is $33,000 a year. White median income, $55,000 a year. Total black population, 13%. Total prison population, 37%. So when you look at those numbers, what do you see?
Well, I think one thing that you said right there is to look at the prison population. That is another factor. Mass incarceration. This is just recent history, but this is connected to the longer history. But recent history is war on drugs, which basically became a war on black and brown men for low-level drug crimes. It fed the mass incarceration of many black and brown men. If you look at the ripple effects of what that means, you're taking them out of families, you're taking them out of the educational process, you're creating more men who women view as not marriable men. So even when you look at what Crystal was talking about before, high rates of illegitimacy in the black community, you can't completely disconnect that fact from many other facts.
Like the knee bone's connected
and I think
to the
a
thigh
lot of
bone,
things are
everything.
connected.
I agree with Charles when he talks about, I agree with Charles, the federal mandatory minimums for drug possession disproportionately affects black males and blacks in general. 13 times more likely blacks are to be incarcerated over mere drug possession and drug sales, right? So that's bad. Senator Rand Paul, Senator Leahy are trying to end that and let it come back on a local prosecutor level so the crime is commiserate with, the punishment, I guess I should say. But back to something that I want to go back in time a little bit. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, his report, and I know you guys don't like me talking. You know what he said at the conclusion of this report he did for President Johnson in 1965? He said the biggest threat to the black race is the breakdown of the black family. At the time, in 1963, you had 23% of all black babies being born out of wedlock. Today, it's 73%. I would argue that when a child isn't in an intact home, we know Brookings Institute has done research. I can pull out reams of research that when a child is not in an intact, that's why you have the surge in high school dropouts. And you know what Moynihan said real quick? Wait, you know what Moynihan said real quick? There's not one black community. There's not one black problem. There's not one black solution. But the pathology that was dragging us down then and now is the fact that we have fatherless homes.
Congressman, go ahead.
But on the other hand, you also had a federal policy that if you were on public aid, you could not have a male in the household. Now, this was federal policy.
We still have that today.
We
still have that today, Representative Rush.
This created
disproportionate number of
more
blacks
issues,
on welfare from population. We represent 13% of the population.
No, it's not a disproportionate number. There are more whites on public aid than blacks. Now, let me tell you about a current federal problem. Let me tell you about a current federal problem right here in Chicago, what you and others have said has more violence than any other black community in America. Just recently, we suffered from the most intense forced mass immigration than any other city in the nation, in the history of this nation. 40,000 families taken up out of public housing, which we admit was not the best housing, and sent all across the city.
The closing down of public housing.
Of assistance,
right.
No kind of assistance. Poor people just dispersed. people who
right.
had
without
other
homes
kinds of
and,
issues, just
right.
dispersed
Let me
across
ask
the city.
Sherilyn,
migration.
Can we put this together?
Right. Sherilyn, let me have you jump
This
in.
is precisely what's wrong with the kinds of conversations that we have about the kinds of issues that we face this week. Because I think all of these points are critically important. I mean, we could talk about African-American women and single moms. We could talk about transportation issues, job issues, and so forth. But Trayvon Martin had two parents, two loving parents. He was being raised by his mother. He went to live with his father. He was not a kid on the streets. He wasn't in a gang. He wasn't raised by a single mom. There was no pathology in his family. We've met his parents. We've met his brother. We know the family that he came from. He came from an intact family. And if you're Sabrina Fulton and you're listening to this program this morning and you're listening to Ms. Wright, you're basically hearing a problem, a real, legitimate problem.
Excuse me,
I let you talk.
I let finish.
We're not just talking about the Zimmerman trial.
We're talking about why the African-American community is having the reaction it had to the acquittal of George Zimmerman. That's what precipitated the conversation.
His peers.
By a jury of his peers.
Right.
That's what precipitated the conversation. And part of the difficulty, ma'am,
hang on 1 second, let her finish.
And part of the difficulty is when we start trying to have these conversations, we end up trying to pit facts against each other. It's possible for both things to be true, for there to be a terrible epidemic of violence within the African American community, and it also to be true that racial profiling is a terrible thing that strikes at the very heart and dignity of African American men, and that left a black teenager dead with no one to pay for it.
Mr. Newt, let me hang on, Congressman. Hang on 1 second. Let me let a couple of others get in here. Newt, we're running out of time here. So give me your just if there is one thing that you hope that you can bring understanding to the African American community, what would that be?
I don't think there is one thing. I think what every American should take out of the last couple of weeks is that the divide in how we see the world is so profound that virtually every white American thought the jury was fine, virtually every African American thought it was terrible. That should tell us something about how deep the divide in reality is about how we see things. That's the most important thing I take out of this situation.
Give you the final word here.
And what I would say is that bias is real, and we're not always aware of our biases.
Yes.
And we're not the people in this particular case may not have been aware of their biases, and they may have been operational the night that Trayvon Martin was killed. The jurors may not have been aware of their biases, and whenever they were deliberating whether or not they made the right choice or not. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that biases are real, and they're baked into the cake of America, and that means that even in our policies and the way that they play out and how they're enforced, it comes into play, and people with skin like mine feel the effects of those biases.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're human, to Charles'
Charles Blow, Sherilyn Ifill, Crystal Wright, Newt Gingrich, Congressman Bobby Rush, thank you so much. I got to run. Come back and join us around the table next time. Thank you for your time. And thank you for watching State of the Union. I'm Candy Crowley in Washington.
It didn't only happen in Detroit. It happened in Nashville. It happened in the Twin Cities. It happened in San Francisco. And most other places adapted.
Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is probably the best parallel
because
city.
They had economic diversity, they had education, and they did not have institutional failure. This Detroit, to me, is declinism 101, whether it's the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire. You got entrenched elites, they're entrenched special interests, they're together forever and ever, they get a culture of mediocrity, they get a culture of cronyism, and it just collapsed.
There is this bigger question. You think about major institutions, whether Washington is broken, schools, cities. George Packer, we discussed the book that he's written called The Unwinding, an Inner History of the New America, and he writes this in part: no one can say when the unwinding began, when the coil that held Americans together in its secure and sometimes stifling grip first gave way. Like any great change, the unwinding began at countless times in countless ways. At some moment, the country, always the same country, crossed a line of history and became irretrievably different. If you were born around 1960 or afterward, you have spent your adult life in the vertigo of that unwinding. You watch structures that had been in place before your birth collapse like pillars of salt across the vast visible landscape. You think a lot about this concept of whether this is American decline or if this is something much more temporary and narrow.
Neither. It's not American decline. It's class. We've had a lot of discussion about race on the show today. To me, the class divide is bigger than the race divide. If you're in the educated class, college-educated communities, you're not seeing decline. You've got intact family structures. You've got rising incomes. You're doing fine. If you're in the less educated, whether you're African American, Latino, white, Asian, you're seeing collapsing social structures. You're seeing 70% of African American kids born out of wedlock, 65% of Latino, high percent of poor white kids. And so what you're seeing is this collapse of order on the bottom. If you're born into a certain class, there are certain railroad tracks. You just go along the tracks.
And that's so inconsistent.
And some people have no railroad.
And you know what, David? That's inconsistent with what the 20th century was about. Because what the 20th century was about was the rise of the middle class and the opening of doors of economic opportunity. And I think that the class divide combined with the race divide is America's greatest 21st century challenge. Because what's changed is the world in which we live. The world in which we live, with new competitors all across the globe and within the changing demographics of America. And so we had substantial progress in the middle of the 20th century when it came to closing the class divide. We've departed from that, and what I'm concerned with is that we, in many, many polite circles, do not think that that class divide is a challenge to Americans' economic competitiveness.
And Governor, you know, my mother, born in Detroit, grew up at a time when a middle-class job in Detroit was possible, that you could really think about sustaining a family on.
Well, that's the whole point, is if we want Congress to act on anything, it is on a strategy to keep and create middle-class jobs in America. You're right. I mean, but we are seeing the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and that large scope of poor, the group is getting larger. So how do we create, in a global economy, middle-class jobs in America? Other countries are doing this. We have not. What we can learn from Germany. We think that because we are exceptional as a nation, that we ought not be borrowing best practices from other countries. But in fact, the other countries have figured out how to crack the code to create advanced manufacturing jobs in their nations. Why can't we? It's because we have gridlock in Congress that refuses to have any hands-on when it comes to the economy.
Race is his first subject, as it would be if you had a black father and a white mother. And all the mental habits he brings to all the other issues grow out of the way he framed race and the way he started thinking about race, his tendency to do on the one hand, on the other, his desire to reconcile opposites, his ability to see different points of view. All the stuff we've come to see him apply to every other issue, it started with race. And I thought this speech was one of the highlights of the presidency. I thought it was a symphony of indignation, professionalism, executive responsibility, personal feeling. It had all these different things woven together, I thought, beautifully. But it's important to remember, race is how he thinks.
But again, I come back because I want to make sure to represent that other side as well. Some conservatives have said, look, this was the wrong moment to inject race into the trial, their view, and for the president to speak out in this way.
Yeah, I guess I would disagree with him. I think if the young man had been a white kid and the older guy had been a black guy, it would be a different story, and the president said that, and I think that happens to be true.
I think that this was the president speaking as a witness to white people. It was really a conversation to explain to white people why there was so much angst in the African American community about this. And the reason why this was an important moment is because we have not arrived. And those in the conservative community that would say that this was not about race need to understand that the moment they can say that I would trade places with an African American person and feel like I've not lost any of my benefits or privileges, that's the point we will have arrived.
Well, you know,
but we haven't gotten there.
I would say
yet.
this is a moment for the Obama presidency and Barack Obama, the person, because I believe that he addressed something that I know was deep, has been deep in his consciousness for the first 5 years of his presidency. And I think what he may have thought is that actions speak louder than words. That in fact, if you confront healthcare disparities through the healthcare law, predatory lending through Dodd-Frank, that if you in fact enforce the civil rights laws, that would be enough. But I think what this may be a recognition of is that the power of the presidency is the bully pulpit, the power to shape hearts, minds, and ideas, the power to lead the nation. It's important to look at Barack Obama's presidency as a transformative presidency in terms of what the nation will become in the 21st century. We've got to seize this moment as a nation, and I think Barack Obama opened the door, and my prayer and hope is that it's going to be a conversation that's going to lead to concrete steps in action, not just by the president, but that it's going to spur others.
And Chuck, if you look at other areas, how does the president use his second term? Where does he intervene on some of these key issues? We see how he's done it here, and as the mayor points out, we'll see where he goes with that. Whether it's immigration or the implementation of health care, he also is now starting to use that bully pulpit.
But you know what was interesting about the conversation that you were having at the beginning of the show and the debate, particularly with Tavis, of, too much caution when it comes to say, that in many ways, that description of President Obama on many issues. Boy, he's too cautious. He waits too long to speak out. He waits too long to use the bully pulpit. But by the way, one other observation that people that I wanted to give on the speech that he made on Friday is that was also the son of an anthropologist. People always forget that. His mother was an anthropologist, an observer of communities that interacting. She did it obviously overseas in Indonesia. And you see that's always been the sort of the intellectual way he looks at this. It bit him politically when he did clings to their guns and Bible. But again, that was Obama, the anthropologist.
And the law professor, right? I mean, Ogletree was saying before the program, he said, look, he poses the uncomfortable questions and lets people grapple with that.
Hey, you guys debate. Right. And then he backs away. But remember, he always, one of the things on race, everybody, David Meredith says, he wants to back off. When he was thinking about running for president, one of the greatest assets he thought is just him winning the presidency. He could be a total failure as president. Winning the presidency meant he was going to be have cracked a ceiling, broken a ceiling for young African-American men. He knew that just the action, not the words, just the simple action was going to make him a role model and say, you know what, this is no longer African-American, young African-American men have, it's not just about getting out of poverty through athletics or through entertainment. There are other ways. He was going to be a role model via just
Gene Robinson said, no caption necessary.
Yeah, but it's worth remembering he's pushing immigration reform.
Yeah.
Among Americans under 5 years old, whites are a minority. And we're going to have a very different conversation in a few years when it's much more multi-ethnic, when it's Latinos, when it's Asians, when it's all these other groups. I'd be fascinated to see how the racial discussion will look. It won't just be two things.
And it's already transforming. I was at the National Council of La Raza yesterday, and the discussion is already changing about the dynamic of the nation. But the important thing is we're at the beginning of this transformation, and we've got to seize the moment.
David and I come from cities where this has already happened, Miami and Los Angeles.
Absolutely.
Where it was blacks and whites, and then now Hispanics, whites. It's a complicated conversation.